Well, welcome to the Reagan Library. For those of you I have not yet had the privilege of meeting, my name is David Trulio, and it's my honor to serve as the president and CEO of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. And as many of you know so well, we begin all of our programming with the Pledge of Allegiance, so I ask that you please stand and join me in honoring our flag and all those who serve under it. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Towards the conclusion of his presidency in May 1988, President Reagan addressed a luncheon hosted by artists and cultural leaders in Moscow. Freedom of the arts had begun to expand in the Soviet Union, and President Reagan drew on his own experience and background as an actor as a way to connect the importance of the arts with civic leadership. He said, quote, "To grasp and hold a vision, to fix it in your senses, that is the very essence of successful leadership, not only on the movie set, where I learned about it, but everywhere." Indeed, the arts, as in politics, the most successful are those who can grasp and hold a vision. When producer Mark Joseph set out to make the Reagan movie, he had a monumental task in telling the story of Ronald Reagan. Some said it could not be made. Funding was an enormous undertaking. COVID threatened to derail it. Online ads were denied, and reviewers attacked it. But it became a fan favorite, and it topped the charts. We hosted a sneak peek of the movie last year, along with members of the cast on this very stage. And now Mark is joining us today to talk about his new book, Making Reagan, which takes us behind the scenes of making the film, a compelling, nearly two-decade odyssey in its own right. None other than lead actor Dennis Quaid said, quote, "I've been in 152 movies. Reagan is the favorite of my career thus far." Pretty amazing praise. Of note, this film is only a part of Mark's accomplished career. He has worked in roles across the entertainment industry, including as a film producer, news anchor, music producer, and radio DJ. And my favorite fun fact about Mark is he can actually read a teleprompter in Japanese. His work includes the Chronicles of Narnia, Ray, and the Passion of the Christ. The Reagan movie was not a Reagan Foundation project. However, I'm very pleased to say that Mark and his team have succeeded in bringing Ronald Reagan and his legacy to millions of people, including those who were born after the president left office. So Mark, thank you for your vision, for your tenacity, and for being with us this evening to share your journey with us. So let's all give a warm welcome to Mark Joseph. Well, Mark, it was a tremendous journey, 19 years in the making. At the conclusion of your book, you quote the famed movie producer Laura Ziskin, who said something remarkable. "Movies aren't made, they're forced into existence." So this is a detailed account of this really long journey. Where did it start? Why do a movie about Ronald Reagan?
Well, I begin the book with being pulled over for speeding in the middle of Illinois with my wife and then 4 young daughters. And I mentioned my daughters' ages because Dad's not going to be speeding in a minivan with 4 little girls under the age of 6. But I pulled over for speeding, and I figured I'd pay the ticket and be done with it. But he said, "You must appear in court in person in Dixon, Illinois." And I'm in Ronald Reagan's hometown, pulled over for speeding. So I thought, this is weird. This is weird. I've got an entire 24 hours to kill here. And that was sort of the genesis of where the idea came from. And what really sparked my attention was just that Dixon is a very normal place. And I thought, this is where our leaders come from. Our leaders come from places like this. And, in many countries, the presidency or the prime ministership is inherited from a grandfather or a father. And yet in America, whether it's Barack Obama or Ronald Reagan or
Bill Clinton,
Jimmy Carter, Lyndon Johnson, these are just normal people from normal families who rise to great heights. And so I think seeing that juxtaposition really got me going. So I have to thank that officer for the $500 fine he gave me. And
was he invited to the premiere?
Well, I haven't heard from him since then. But he was a young fellow and was just doing his job, of course. But when I went to pay my fine, they said I was the 19th person that day. That's a pretty good business they had going there for a while. But I have to thank him for it.
Well, I think you've made the point that talent, finance, and distribution are essentially legs of a stool when you're making a movie, and talent comes first. So tell us about the monumental role of casting Ronald Reagan.
Sure.
A person that roughly half of America knows really well. So
very tough. It's easy to play Abraham Lincoln because who's going to contradict you and say, you got that wrong. But with Reagan, you just go to YouTube and you can critique performance. So that was a real challenge, I think, for us to find the right person and also for Dennis to get the role right. And on the set, sometimes I'd see him with his phone watching a Reagan speech he was about to do just to get the cadence right. But, we spoke to a lot of different actors, either personally or through their agent. And Dennis was always my first choice, but he wasn't always available. So I had to always be on the lookout. And so if you read the book, you'll see we talked to Nicolas Cage for a while. It would have taken a lot of hair and makeup, but he is a great actor. Jim Caviezel was somebody we thought about, Christian Bale, different actors. But once I knew Dennis was available, that was where we wanted to go. Dennis has a lot of similarities to Reagan, too. His mother was about as religious as Reagan's mother was, a strong woman of faith. And then also his father was alcoholic, and they were both overshadowed by their actress wives for a period of time as well, Meg Ryan and Jane Wyman. So a lot of similarities there between the two.
Well, you mentioned these really important women, and casting Nancy Reagan is of the utmost importance in the film. You zeroed in on Penelope Ann Miller. What did she bring? What did you see in her? What was that process of casting her?
Yeah, boy, she did such a great job. She really studied, she read, and she talked to people that knew Mrs. Reagan or former aides and different things like that. But, I remember driving over to Dennis's house and saying, Penelope Ann Miller, how about Penelope Ann Miller? And he loved the idea. He said, Carlito's Way, Carlito's Way. So that was great, but then they also had to have chemistry. That's the intangible that you just never know. But they really, really had that great chemistry together. I think that she was able to really channel Nancy Reagan's characteristics. And so that's the thing that you can't predict, but it worked out well, I think. But I'm biased.
So let's go a little deeper into the topic of strong women in Ronald Reagan's life. So let's start where it began with his mother, Nellie.
Yep.
And we have a clip. So we're going to start by showing a clip, and then we'll talk a little bit about it. So to the team, let's go ahead and play that. Now, to be sure, every mother has a profound impact on her children, but what impact did you see that Nellie Reagan had on the man that Ronald Reagan became?
Yeah, really profound. The fact that she gave him that book really, I think, shaped his life. I think she probably saw that he was on a path maybe similar to his father.
That Printer of Udell's.
That Printer of Udell's is the book. So she gives it to him when at 11 and a half years old. In the movie, we have it coming from the pastor who gives it to the mother, but we don't know that for sure. But that book really, really shaped his life. And I think he saw in there the possibility. He had just recently had the event in the snow where he found his father drunk in the snow. And I think she thought, I needed to get this kid something to get him to hang on to. And so the book is about the son of an alcoholic who finds faith and then grows up to become a congressman. So it's almost the trajectory of Reagan's life, except for the congressman, president part being different. But I think that really shaped his life. And after he read it, he went to his mother and said, I want to declare my faith and be baptized. And so, but he was 11 and a half, and the pastor said, you have to be 12. So somehow he convinced the pastor to do a 6-month early baptism. And that always confused me. I thought, what's the rush? Why can't you wait 6 months? But the disciples of Christ, it's very important to be, baptism and salvation are very linked, more so than most Protestant denominations. So I think in his mind, he's thinking, I don't want to go 6 months in this unsure state of mind. So he wanted to be baptized then.
And maybe use his powers of
Persuasion, that's right,
on the pastor.
Convince the preacher.
Well, let's turn to the other major female figure in President Reagan's life, obviously Nancy Reagan, and one scene in the Reagan film that was produced here at the Reagan Library in the actual plane that flew as Air Force One when President Reagan was on it. So that was filmed right here, and you call it in the book as a pivotal scene. So let's take a look at that pivotal scene and discuss it in a moment. So team, please cue it up. So to what extent do you think people realize the impact and significance of Nancy Reagan, the impact she had on her husband?
Yeah, every movie involves the growth of the character and the arc of the story. And I think this is the moment where, in a way, he goes from being his mother's son to his wife's husband, because Mrs. Nellie Reagan, his mother, tended to be very optimistic and looks for the best in people. Nancy had a tougher view. She was more looking out for who had his best interests at heart. And she could kind of see who was really trying to promote themselves versus promote him. And so he needed to become a little bit more skeptical and tougher. And I think this is part of that moment where she really helps him to say, hey, we got to be realistic here. These people are literally out to destroy you. And he's thinking, well, you know, they're good fellows. And so this is a moment of, I would say, character growth for him when he learns to be a little bit less trusting of people and a little bit more realistic of people's motives and intentions.
So Ronald Reagan's faith, as this discussion bears out, but we'll go deeper into it, his faith really features prominently in the film. What did you learn about Ronald Reagan's faith as a result of taking on this project? He was well known to be a believing Christian, but there's probably more to this, right?
Yeah, I'm just a big fan of letting people be who they are, and rather than watering down his mother's faith or making it some kind of a generic thing, it's a very important part. So alcoholic dad and religious mom, it's a perfect combination for a movie. We let them both be themselves. But yeah, she had a near-death experience, and she made a vow to God that if he would save her life, that she would serve him. And she was influenced by radio preachers at the time. And so,
was this the flu or what?
Yeah, it was. I believe it was some kind of a flu.
The Spanish influenza.
Yeah, that swept, and she came very close to death. And so, that was her vow. And so now Reagan's brother Neil remained Catholic, like Jack, and was not quite of the same stripe as Ron and his mother were. But it's a really important piece of the puzzle. And I would say, you know very well, Dave, all the books written on Ronald Reagan over the years, got to be hundreds, maybe into the thousands by now. And yet Paul Kengor, who we based the movie on, he happened to go back to the church Reagan grew up in and said, can I see the sermons that young Ronald Reagan had heard as a kid? And the pastor said, well, they're in the basement. Nobody's ever asked to see them before. So of all the scholars and all the geniuses, they hadn't bothered to check for that.
And that really is a remarkable point. Think of all the scholarship and writing about Ronald Reagan. Nobody had, prior to Paul Kengor, had bothered to go there, ask these questions, and see what shaped this man's.
And they were there. They were there in the basement. And so what he found was a lot of anti-communist sermons from the preacher. It was shortly after the Bolshevik Revolution, so this is a topic that he was addressing. But not all preachers were doing that at the time, of course. And then Paul even found records of a Soviet dissident visiting Reagan's church when Reagan was 17 years old. And so we included that character, B.E. Kirchman, in the film as well. So it's once you understand that, everything sort of falls into place. Everything makes sense. It was almost like he was, programmed is a strong word, but he was really influenced at a very young age by a pastor, by his mother, who was very interested in missions as well. To really care about the rest of the world, care about the Soviet Union, communism. And so that really helped us to understand. It's almost like Hollywood was a diversion and a training ground to acquire the skills necessary to do what he had to do later.
So let's take a different angle on Ronald Reagan's faith, and that's through John Barletta. So John Barletta was a Secret Service agent from the Boston area who apparently was very good with horses, which is why he was assigned to guard President Reagan at the ranch. But you, before he passed away, you got to speak to John Barletta at some length.
Yeah, I would talk to John whenever I had a question, and I had probably 50 or 55 of the folks that knew Reagan to talk to. And so whenever I had a question, I'd call up there. I'll just give you one example that you may not have heard before. I think it's in the book as well. But there was a guy that I met who was in Reagan's church. By the way, Dave, when Reagan came back from Washington, D.C. after being president to his home church, Bel Air Presbyterian, the pastor, Don Muma, made him retake the membership courses as if he's a new member. You know, I mean, what other country would that happen in, that a president is forced to retake the membership classes? So in the membership class, one of the guys in that class told me that Reagan had said he went and forgave John Hinckley in person for shooting him. I said, this cannot be true. So I called John. I said, John, is this possibly true? And he said, well, there's no Secret Service records of that meeting, and Mrs. Reagan says it never happened, and so I don't think so. Well, then I called the head of St. Elizabeth Hospital, the mental institution where Hinckley had been, and he said, Reagan called me and asked me if he could meet with Hinckley, and I said, please don't do it, Mr. President. That would be a really bad idea to reward assassins or potential assassins with private visits, and I would prefer you not do it. So he said, as far as I know, it didn't happen, but I can't guarantee it didn't happen. So things like that, interesting stories along the way that I didn't put in the film, but it just showed you where his heart was at. And he said later that on the operating table, he had the strong sense that if he didn't forgive Hinckley, he wouldn't survive. And so he said, I had to take a moment and just forgive him in my own mind before they operated on him. So it was really on his mind. But yeah, those are the kinds of stories that pop up from time to time that I don't have a conclusive answer to, but certainly interesting.
So let's switch gears. To make a movie is to essentially launch a business, right? So as the producer, the financial responsibility is on your shoulders. Yeah. So what does it take financially to make a movie like this, and to make a movie where you and your immediate colleagues have creative control and aren't told how to make it? What was that like?
Yeah. The way that I do movies generally is we finance it separately and then bring to a studio for distribution. And so that's what we did here as well. Oklahoma was great to us. They had a great incentive program that if you shoot in Oklahoma, they give you X dollars back on every dollar you spend. So about 37 cents on the dollar.
And roughly what percentage of the film was filmed in Oklahoma?
Well, most of it, except for out here and the ranch, was all in Oklahoma. So we recreated Dixon, and we had a large Masonic temple that we filmed almost everything inside there. We created the Oval Office and all the different scenes. So thank you to Oklahoma for that, for their contribution, and then others were investors who wanted to be a part of it. And it's a long journey. It's a lot of money, and COVID alone probably cost us around $2 million. So, but I had one of those decisions I had to make before we started, and my co-producer, John Sullivan, came to me and said, okay, here's the deal. We have to decide, are we going or not? We can start shooting or wait till COVID is over. And I thought at the time, I had, as we all probably did, I had friends die on me. And I thought, how pathetic would it be if I died almost filming this film? So I said, let's just go. We don't know what that means, but we just went. And it cost us about $2 million extra, about almost just under $2 million, because of, we had to have a clinic, basically a medical clinic on site, and every day everybody's tested. I was tested for probably 4 months straight through the entire process of sticking that thing up your nose every day. Wow. So it seems like another time in another world.
In terms of raising the money, tell us what happened in Nashville.
Oh, well, yeah, you meet some interesting people along the way. We had a group in Nashville that was going to finance us and 10 other movies. And so we were unveiled at a swank party and everything. And then all of a sudden, over the course of the next year, we kept waiting for our funds to come through. And one day my screenwriter called me and said, I just dropped by that office. I drove by that office, and there's a for lease sign on that office. So I'm like, this does not sound good. And sure enough, they went under. And so all of us, with our 10 different movies, had to, so things like that, along the way. And the problem is it took us off the market for a year because we were just waiting. So we weren't out. So that's an example of a lost year. And then, of course, COVID hit. That set us back. And then I think we're going to show the scene later, but there's some COVID stories from the set. And then even the actors' strike then hit us as well. That was about 108 days, I think it was. And believe it or not, the Russia-Ukraine war affected us because some of our vendors that we were working with were going to be in Russia. And so we had to stop all that as well. So we really pretty much experienced everything you could experience in terms of being kneecapped during the process.
And maybe without getting too specific, how are you paying your bills? Or you have other jobs you're working on to finance it? Or how does that work?
Yeah, well, we really wanted to focus, so we tried to make sure that people were taken care of, during the time we shot and afterwards as well. But yeah, we spent a lot of time on the road screening the film. So we screened for 3,000 people in 11 states as we were preparing to release. And that really helped us to work out the kinks. That 98% approval rating came because of a lot of good feedback from people.
Well, let's talk about that. So I suspect most people know, but maybe not everybody knows about Rotten Tomatoes, and specifically the tomato meter and the popcorn meter.
Yes.
So
yes.
Tell us, walk us through that.
Yeah. So normally films, the tomato meter is the critics' scores, all averaged, and then the popcorn
Approved
meter,
critics on Rotten.
Approved critics, right? The popcorn meter is the average person who watched the movie. You have to prove that you watched the movie. So normally there's a 5 or 10 point gap, or they're close. And ours we actually, I have applied to Guinness World Book of Records for the greatest gap between critics and moviegoers in the history of all movies ever made. So it's an 80-point gap, 98%.
So I literally looked this up today. 18% on the tomato meter and 98% on the popcorn meter.
It's so befitting of Ronald Reagan, because the equivalent of film critics would be someone like Clark Clifford in Washington, D.C., the smartest man in D.C., who called Reagan an amiable dunce. And I think Reagan enjoyed being underestimated. I think he cultivated being underestimated. I think he liked it, actually. He would cultivate the image of the guy who wants to take the naps all the time, and because that makes your enemies let their guard down. And so I think there was that reminds me, Dave, there was 2 things that I learned about Reagan that show a guy who's thinking ahead. On the red carpet, when he would line up, he would often pose on the very far end on the carpet. And so, Errol Flynn's in the middle, and he's in the very side, and people would say, what a modest guy that guy is. But he was thinking ahead in the captions, left to right, gets to be mentioned first, Ronald Reagan. So he's no dummy, right?
That's why I'm sitting in.
That's right, he's over here, right. I was hoping for that seat, but the other one was you'll rarely see a photo of him with his arms around people because it makes your suit uneven and rumpled, and so always hands to the side in photos. So there's a couple of Hollywood tricks there that he learned.
So in terms of the business and the science of what you did, you had these test screenings. There were no leaks, were there, as a result of that?
No. Yeah.
But in the book, you talk about how you discovered that particularly young people didn't really know a whole lot about communism or the evil empire. So how did you address that gap? Or how did you discover it, and what did you do about it?
Yeah, so look, we all have our blind spots when we're close to the work like we were. And so one of the things we learned was that young people were not understanding the concept of the evil empire. What's so evil about these guys? Communism is nice, you share everything, and it's hunky-dory. And so we realized people under the age of 40 didn't know what we were talking about. And so we had to show, not just tell, about the evil of the evil empire. So we had to go back and create an entire opening to the film over the credits, where you see scenes of people being shot at and chased into East Germany or from West Germany, and people running through barbed wire to get away from communism, and just to give just a taste of what that's about. So that was something that I didn't anticipate, but we have to keep telling these stories to the next generation, or they won't understand what we're talking about, and that was part of that. The other thing that we had to work on was, originally we didn't meet Dennis Quaid until about 20-something minutes into the film, and our film test audience was like, "Hey, we came to see Dennis Quaid playing Ronald Reagan. What's going on here?" So we realized we had to rework that a bit. So we brought the assassination.
It's really well done because it grabs you as an audience member up front.
Yeah.
And then takes you back to where he starts as a boy.
Yeah, the audience is really smart, and they wanted to see Dennis, and I can't blame them. He's on the poster, and so we had to rejig that a little bit, but we still kept a good chunk of the childhood in there. We violated most of the rules of filmmaking. Most biopics are 2 weeks in somebody's life, like the Lincoln movie, for instance. But I think you really can't understand Reagan without seeing that childhood and seeing how that was so integral to what he did later.
Well, speaking of the Cold War, as we were a moment ago, let's watch a powerful scene about a pivotal moment in the Cold War, specifically at Reykjavik in Iceland. So tell us, what were you seeking to communicate about Ronald Reagan, about the strength and his approach to negotiations?
Well, he took big gambles. There's no doubt about it. That was a big gamble. And at the time, a lot of us thought maybe he blew it, came back without a deal.
Tons of heat, took tons of
heat. And he may have lost the midterms because of that. Just before the '86 midterms, which could have gone, the momentum from this, leading into that, may have lost him the Senate, which may have lost him Robert Bork, et cetera. So there's a price he paid for this. But he seemed to have a good instinct for negotiations. I think that he had learned with the Screen Actors Guild, as the negotiator there, kind of when to fold and when to, but there's no doubt it was a gamble. And at the time, it was called a reckless gamble. But I think he had a kind of an intuitive sense that if he did this, they'd come back later. So it's pluses and minuses there.
So let's come back to Dennis Quaid, who obviously was so central to that last scene. He's playing a legendary figure. This is a monumental task. Dennis has spoken publicly, including on this stage, about how daunting that was. Right. Roughly half of the audience for the film has direct memory of Ronald Reagan and what he was like. So how did you guide Dennis in the portrayal? Obviously a very seasoned actor, but you certainly had your own vision and position to offer advice. And what was your guidance without falling into stereotypes or caricature or anything like that?
Yeah, I remember what made it particularly difficult, Dave, was in the same day, because of the nature of shooting, we'd be shooting 1947 and 87 in the same day. So 47 in the morning, 87 in the afternoon. So I'd have to go up and remind him, hey, don't forget you're 40 years older now, so talk lower, slower, or you're younger, higher, faster. So that was part of the really challenging dynamic, because he did talk very differently in cadence and so forth.
Sounds like you made it hard on Dennis Quaid.
Oh my goodness, yeah, it was really tough. And I would occasionally send little clips off to some of Reagan's aides, and I'd say, hey, how's it feeling? I remember one of them said, little advice along the way. But Dennis would also be watching some YouTube videos on his phone. He really took it seriously. But yeah, we wanted to avoid, there's so many great SNL sketches of Reagan, including, I believe, Dennis's brother Randy played him one time, Johnny Carson, Rich Little, and they're all over the top. So I remember one time I came up to him and I said, just don't try too hard, just be Dennis Quaid, because you already have a lot of those characteristics that he had. So, but I think he very carefully avoided, even the worst critics of our film praised Dennis for the work that he did, he and Penelope especially.
Well, you recount in the book that you bought Dennis Quaid a Stetson cowboy hat here at the museum.
I did.
And you gave it to him, and he said, quote, "I tried on the cowboy hat you gave me, but it's just too big." Then he paused for dramatic effect and said, "But I think I can grow into it."
That's right.
So tell us about that moment.
Boy, he left me hanging. We had dinner out at Gladstone's in Malibu, and we spent the evening talking about the role. And look, for any actor, this is a daunting challenge. Again, it's easy to play George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, whatever, because all the people that would contradict you are dead and gone. But there's plenty of people. In fact, probably the docents here would be the first to say, "You're getting that wrong."
You don't mess with the docents.
The docents, boy, they're tough. They know everything.
Everything.
And I was talking to one earlier, that's why I thought of it, who was correcting me, of course. But Dennis had a personal affinity. He and his father were driving down the highway in 1964 when the speech came on the radio. And they
Time for choosing.
together, Time for Choosing. And he said his dad was like pounding the dashboard saying, "You tell him, Ronnie." So he had that memory as a child. And when he called his mother and told him about this possibility, she said, "You've got to take it. This is going to be great." And so she was so excited about it. So maybe his mother was 92 at the time. So I think it was just a matter of, but it's a great lesson too. He said a tingle of fear went up his spine when he heard it. And he said he's learned in life that when you get that feeling, you have to do it if you have that fear.
When you cast Dennis Quaid, did you ever think out of the 150 plus movies that he did, this is going to be his favorite?
No, that's just one of the greatest honors that I could receive. And I was there the day it went from number 2 to 1. We had an interview in Texas at like 10 a.m. And he said to the interviewer, "It's my second favorite movie of all time." Then at 3 o'clock, he said, "It's my favorite movie of all time." So something happened between 10 and 3 that drove it up the scale from 2 to 1. But I mean, think of the movies he's been in, right? I mean, The Right Stuff and The Rookie and all these incredible movies. So for him to say that is just about as good as it gets for me.
So back to the business of making movies, you cite in the book a Hollywood Reporter poll that suggests that 52% of Republicans skip movies where the star is a liberal, 36% of Democrats skip movies where the star is a conservative. So first of all, I think that's an interesting societal commentary, but how did this shape your thinking and your approach to the
Yeah, it's tough. Well, my nightmare would have been to hire a great actor to play the role, and then the actor says something like, "I really enjoyed playing Ronald Reagan, but he was a horrible person," or something like that, because the people who watch movies, they want to know that you like the person you're playing at a very minimum. You don't have to be a Republican, but it's nice to know that you don't hate the person you're playing. And that's the case a lot of times. I'm thinking in particular the actor who played, who shall not be mentioned, but who played, was it Moses? Yeah, Moses. And in interviews, he said, "I really enjoyed playing Moses, but he was a terrorist and a horrible person." He's like, okay, there's about a lot of Christians and Jews and Muslims who don't think that Moses was a terrorist, and so that really depresses turnout. And so that was important, just to know that Dennis liked the character he was playing, and Nancy too. I think for those two actors, and then we had a great cast. I mean, Dan Lauria, who played Tip O'Neill, right. And it was great because Dan, it was funny we shot during the election, and so I remember that John Voight would go off to make campaign videos for Trump, and then Mark Moses would go to Montana to do a fundraiser for the Democratic candidate in Montana. So we were all over the map with our actors. But that was great, and I think it's a great lesson for all of us. Everybody had a different point of view, but we all worked together for a common purpose in an election year. And there was nobody that was arguing or having problems. We all worked together for a common cause. And so that gives me hope that we can do that in real life too.
And you didn't shy away from voicing some of the criticisms of the Reagan presidency. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and the soundtrack that you applied to that specific set of scenes?
Yeah, I think, first of all, when I hear criticism that we were a hagiography, I'm thinking, did you guys watch the same movie that I made? Because in my movie, Ronald Reagan is dumped by his teenage sweetheart. He's dumped by his first wife. He's washed up at 50, divorced with 2 kids, sitting on a park bench asking his mom, what went wrong with my life? So I think they might have skipped that part or missed that part of the movie, but we wanted to show the full humanity of what he went through. And I also wanted to show the critics. And so we have an entire, almost a minute montage of all the protesters and what the reason they hated him for, which was everything from nuclear war issues to homelessness to AIDS. And then we got the rights to Land of Confusion by Genesis, which was like the great anti-Reagan song.
And the video trashes Ronald.
Right, the video was the crazy dolls of Reagan and Nancy. And when my music supervisor went to get the rights, he was told, well, we wrote the song because we don't like him. That's why we wrote it. So why would we participate in this project? And my supervisor said, well, this is a chance to hate on him for a full minute in front of the whole world. This is why you wrote the song. So they said, okay. So they cashed the check and got to hate on him for a whole minute. But yeah, Land of Confusion. and there were other songs, but that was, again, we wanted to show there's a bit of a fiction today that everybody loved Ronald Reagan, and that wasn't the case. I remember my friends from junior high, and there's a good 40% of the country that always did not like him, disliked him very strongly.
The left hated him.
That's right, and he had family members protesting against him as well. So, yeah, let's not be too rose-colored in our look back.
He's aged very well.
He's aged well, everybody's favorite grandfather, but at the time he was disliked by a sizable chunk of the population.
I do want to get back to more of the specifics. Well, actually, let's actually go. Let's show our next video here in a second. But this goes back to the difficulty of producing a film, and COVID, as we've discussed briefly, was a very significant challenge. So there's a particular scene that is romantic and also very significant to COVID. Let's go ahead and play that, please. Please elaborate about the substance of the scene and then what was happening in reality.
I hate to ruin this scene for the rest of you here, but that is the scene of COVID transmission from Dennis and Penelope, one to another. I don't know who gave it to who, but one of them gave it to the other one, and the next day, they both had full-blown COVID. So you'll never look at that scene the same way again. Yeah, that was the final day of shooting for the two of them. And so they flew back to California, and the next day I get a call that they both have COVID, and Dennis had a 104-degree temperature. So they gave all for this movie.
And then you had to shut down the set for 10 days.
Yeah, so that was the second shutdown, another 10 days. And so I remember wandering around Guthrie with John Voight and I are walking down the street, and we have nothing to do for the next 10 days. So we hunkered down, and then he prepared for his portion because the two of them had finished their work.
And when not only are you shut down for 10 days, but you have to keep paying people, right?
Yeah, 20 days, basically, yeah. So that was another part of that $2 million was paying salaries for those days off. And, in a more rational world, you would contact Trace and, say, hey, these 6 people need to be out, but our entire set had to shut down for the CDC guidelines, which was a bit of a crazy thing when you think of hundreds of people on a set that have to stop.
Right, and you fell under federal rules.
That's right. Yeah, because of the unions that we had to report to, we had to abide by all those rules.
So we've talked about financial challenges, COVID challenges, critics were challenging the movie once it was made. Your online ads were pulled at one point.
Yeah.
Challenges abound. So reflecting on that, what is your advice to a young Mark Joseph or to a dreamer out there who thinks, I want to take on a big, important project? Maybe it's in film, maybe it's in some other endeavor. What are your reflections on that? What's your advice to that person?
Well, I joke that if you have a young person in your life who wants to go into film, give them this book and talk them out of it. They will stay far away from it and go into something more sensible, like dentistry. I thought about this a lot. Reagan and Judge Clark, who, as you know, was one of his closest confidants, they would often talk about the DP, they called it, the divine plan. They would remind each other that in the midst of difficulties that there is a divine plan at work, and don't worry, it's going to be okay. And so I had that sense a lot. My colleagues and I, we would remind each other, it's going to be okay, we're going to get through this, because we had so much to get through. So it's a good thing that we're not told ahead of time how the journey is going to go, because most of us would say, yeah, no thanks, I think I'll do something.
But quitting was an option. It was something you struggled with, wasn't it? Like I might not do this, or I might stop the project, right?
Yeah, well, we just, we had a lot of intangibles, and so there were times when, is this really going to happen, So many things have to align to make a film. You have to have the actors and the financing, the distribution, all these different things have to kind of match up. You can have 3 going and 1 not working. And so it's a lot of intangibles, and you just have to have faith and trust, and that there is a DP guiding, and somehow you muddle through.
So let's talk some more about some of the people who were very close to Ronald Reagan with whom you spoke. So you met with dozens of people. They include Ed Meese, George Shultz, speechwriter Peter Robinson. What did you learn from these interactions, and what, as a result of those interactions, made it into the film? Or is there an example of something?
Yeah, I would say a lot of their little stories here and there. One in particular, I spoke to a fellow who said he was there the moment that Reagan lost in '76. And I said, well, what did he say to you? He said he turned to me and said, I guess it wasn't God's will. Okay, great. That's great to have that. And I think he thought at that moment that he was going to be too old to run in 4 years, because back then it was, 69 was was the oldest in history. So it was almost like he took a very spiritual view of something had gone wrong, or he hadn't measured up or something. And so that was great to have that line. And then there was another guy that I talked to. I think I shared the story earlier with you about Peter with the sunglasses and all that, and just finding humanity.
Well, tell us about that.
Yeah. So part of it is everybody says Ronald Reagan's great, perfect, and I think, well, I can't make a movie about a perfect person. You got to have, like the rest of us, he's got to be human. And so what would make him upset or angry? He says, well, if we overscheduled him, he would have a little flash of temper. I said, well, give me an example. He said, well, one day he came and he saw the schedule, and he said he threw his glasses across the table. He said, guys, I can't do all this in one day. You've overscheduled me. I'm like, okay, great. Now we have some humanity. And you can see that in the public. There's twice that you see a little flash of temper. The first is when he says, I paid for this microphone, Mr. Breen. Remember that one?
In New Hampshire.
And the second is the last day of the campaign in '80, I think it was, in San Diego. There's a heckler there. And finally, Reagan just says, shut up. Just for like a split second. And so it's good to know that, that he's like the rest of us, and he has those little moments. But they said he would pass very quickly, and it was not a vindictive or angry thing. It was just a frustration, moments of frustration like that.
Well, we do have a few moments for questions. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, and we should be able to have someone come over to you. And I'm going to look at one well-known actor in the room and see if he might have a question.
Yes.
But if not, he could pass. There's a question over here.
Hi. Curious about the scenes up at Reagan Ranch. Were they filmed actually at the ranch, or did you create the buildings on a set somewhere?
Yeah, all those scenes are at the real places. By the way, I'm told, thanks to you guys and to COVID, because you were shut down for a while, we were able to shoot here on Air Force One, on Marine One, and also the KAL shoot-down scene in your other aircraft, as well as the Reagan Ranch. So it's a little eerie to think that these are the actual places where these conversations might have happened.
Yeah, literally on the plane that he used as Air Force One is where that Air Force One scene was filmed.
Yeah. So it's right there. And then, of course, in the kitchen at the Reagan Ranch, they're talking whether you should run or not and all that kind of stuff, and on the boat. So we really were thankful to you guys here at the Library and Museum, as well as the Reagan Ranch, to be able to shoot. I'm told that this is every other movie in history has been Air Force One sets, that this is the first time that it's actually been an Air Force One. So thanks to you guys for that. But yeah, it was important as much as possible, even down to there's a scene of the Japanese Prime Minister's office. And we went to Japan and actually shot in his actual office, and then put our
that's pretty extraordinary.
We put our actors in digitally later. So we wanted to even get details like that down.
Well, something maybe a lot of people don't know about you is you've lived in Japan, and you have a long history in Japan.
Yeah, I met with the Japanese Prime Minister. That was one of the people I met with, and he gave me some great stories. And he said that Reagan had told him, he said he had told Reagan they were going to a summit, and Reagan, he told Reagan, I'll be the catcher and you be the pitcher. But don't forget, sometimes the pitcher has to listen to the catcher's signals and go along with it. And Reagan said, okay.
Was this Nakasone?
Nakasone, yeah.
Wow. So you obviously, Prime Minister Nakasone is no longer alive. So
that's right,
what a treasure that you were able
to
see him.
Yeah, he was about 97 at the time, I think. And,
wow.
And so I was able to screen the film for his son recently.
Yeah.
So we wanted to get those little details right, as much as possible. And so we worked hard to get those exact locations.
People rightly understand and appreciate the relationship Ronald Reagan had with Prime Minister Thatcher. Less well known is the relationship he had with Prime Minister Nakasone, which was really significant.
Yeah, our Thatcher actress as well. I should mention that Nakasone was going to be played by Kari Hiroyuki Tagawa, but he had a stroke and couldn't join us, so we replaced him with another actor. But our Margaret Thatcher actress did an incredible job, Leslie Ann Down. And there's a great story. Reagan loved strong women. His mother, his wife, and Margaret Thatcher. And there was one aide told me that one day she was upset with him and was kind of yelling at him on the phone. And he put the phone away for a second. He turned to his aides and said, "Isn't she great?" And then put the phone back up to be yelled at some more. It was probably over the Falklands or something.
There were some tense moments,
Right.
Including around Grenada.
Yeah.
Next question. There's a question right over here. Just wait for the microphone, please.
Sorry. In this day and age, mostly, you hate to say it, films are not as popular as TV series are that are on all different stations. You have great material. Could you expand where the future is for the Reagan movie is and the material you have shot?
Yeah, we left a lot on the cutting room floor. So we're toying with the idea of putting out a different package, maybe in a series of some kind. But the film is 2 hours and 15 minutes long, and we probably have another hour or so of footage that didn't make it. But there's some good stuff in there. So we'll see. We're working on that idea. So hopefully we'll come back out with something that you could watch at home. That'd be more an expanded version of it.
Should someone do a 10-part series on?
I've had a lot of people say that. Yeah, there's a lot of good stuff in there. But he really lived a large life, and so you could make a movie about each era almost, and that's part of what made him who he became.
Who's next? There's a question here in the back, right there.
You briefly touched upon the explaining communism to young people who might not understand it. As a whole, though, is there one takeaway that you hope for younger generation who did not get to experience Reagan's legacy to come off of the movie?
Yeah, I think it's important, and in the movie we have the line where he says, "Somebody who agrees with you 80% of the time is an 80% friend, not a 20% enemy." And we can't forget that there are true enemies of America who would like to destroy us. There are other countries around the world that we are a nuisance to their ambitions. And so, they love it when we fight each other. When we're arguing on social media about this issue or that issue, they love it, and they try to foment it, and they maybe even push it and help boost the advertising of it. So we have to be mindful of that. We can have our differences, but at the end of the day, we're all Americans, and we face powerful enemies from around the world. And so we have to continue our debates. That's fine, but always remembering that we're still brothers and sisters, and we have very, very powerful and evil enemies who would love to destroy us, would love to see us destroy each other. It's to their benefit that we destroy each other.
Of course, President Reagan was a model of civility in the public square, a man of great principle, but who could also forge compromises and get things done. He couldn't have done anything legislatively without the support of Democrats in the Congress.
Yeah, and again, I don't want to be too rose-colored in that. He had powerful opponents. Ted Kennedy was sort of sending advice through another fellow to the Soviets on how they should beat Reagan, or how they could defeat Reagan. And my favorite phrase from Ted Kennedy was, Ted Kennedy said about Reagan, "He must love poor people because he's created so many of them." So they were very tough with each other. And yet, at the end of the day, Bobby Kennedy, I think he might have told me or somebody else, that he said to his uncle Ted, "You got to be tougher on Reagan." And Ted said, "Well, yeah, but he's still a patriot. He still loves our country. We're two Irishmen." So there's that balance of being tough on each other and yet remembering we're still both Americans.
Who's next? Right over there.
Did the family have any input into the movie?
Yeah, so they have their own books and documentaries and projects. So we were kind of always careful to not jump in on their territory. But I've known Mike for many years, and so I met with Mike maybe 15 years ago, and he gave me some stories. But in general, as with the library, we wanted to be kind of respectful of our role and the things that they have going on. So no direct.
I grabbed the book because at the top blurb says, "If you want to understand my father, watch the Reagan movie. If you want to understand how this amazing movie came to be, then Making Reagan is must reading." Michael Reagan. So, but he had nothing to do with it, and neither did we as a foundation, other than saying, yes, you could film in a few places here.
Yeah, and you also had events here that we would get a chance to meet some of the people that knew Reagan, and so you guys were really helpful in that way, just to But in terms of, Mrs. Reagan made it, I sent a note up to Mrs. Reagan at the very beginning, just said, here's what we're doing. And she sent a nice note back and just said, thank you. We don't endorse projects, which we didn't ask for. But all she asked for was that we let her know before our big announcement came. So if I was going to make a casting announcement, I would send a note up to her through John that, hey, next week we're going to announce this. And that was great. She didn't ask for, I wanted the viewer to come to the movie knowing that we hadn't carried water for anybody or any group or any association, and we didn't owe anybody anything. We could tell the story, honestly. And so what you get is what we actually, wanted to say.
There's a question over here somewhere, right over there.
Mark, I recall 19 years of your life was dedicated to this. You had a family in Southern California. How did you manage all that?
I have 6 children, and so it's not easy, but we all have a lot of fun together, and they traveled a lot with me to the set, and we were on the set. I think they're all in the movie in one place or another. A lot of cheap labor there. So I think you see them. You'll see my wife in one of the scenes. You see my kids in various places. So they were all a part of the process, and we try to have as much fun as we can.
And you just had to be fundraising all the time, right? I mean,
Yeah. You know what that's like. Yeah.
You believe in the mission.
That's right.
It's not hard, right?
Yeah. We found some good people that wanted to come alongside.
Right. Next question, right over there.
Funding problems aside, where else did you get major pushback from? What entity or political force hindered you making this movie?
Yeah, we were disappointed by Facebook's reactions to us. They suspended our account for 2 days. They blocked our advertising attempts. And this is pretty serious. If you're running a 26-mile marathon and somebody sidelines you for 5 minutes, you can't get that time back. It is what it is.
And what was the basis by which
Let's see. One was that it might impact the election. The other was that it involved a political figure. I'm thinking Ronald Reagan hasn't run for office in 40 years. So those were very odd.
He died in 2004.
Yeah, he died in 2004, and so I think there was things like that would come up, but again, you can't get that back, and so that was devastating. So in spite of that, we did the numbers we did, but we faced those headwinds.
Will the next project like this run into the same kind of social media problems, or has that been addressed somehow?
I don't know. I mean, there's a change. Obviously, there's a different attitude on the part of social media groups like that, and of course, Twitter is in different hands now. But the standard should be applied across the board. It shouldn't just be our movie. So if I saw it happening to others, I would feel differently. But we were really singled out. But that's just something we had to live with. But it really needs to change.
Time for one last question. There's a question right over there. So a question about Marion Cooper.
Yeah, no, we didn't. We missed that one. No, there's so many great scenes like that we just couldn't cover in the time we had. And everybody has their favorite Reagan moments, and so sometimes it's hard to tell them that we couldn't cover that. But that's one of the ones that we couldn't cover. But you mentioned Marion Ross. So let me just riff off Marion Ross for a second. Mom from Happy Days. She gave me such a great insight. I would collect these insights from different people. And she had been to the Soviet Union in the 80s, and she said on the street she saw posters of Reagan with like a hideous creature, with talons, but it was Reagan's face. And the Soviets were putting these posters up in the streets to make the people fear Ronald Reagan. I thought that was so great to get that insight and even as we created the Victor character, just things like that really helped us. And then John Voight had been to the Soviet Union before and after the fall of communism. And he said that before, during communism, the people's eyes were dead. And when he came back later, their eyes were alive. That's how communism affected people's everyday lives. And you could see the spirit came back, their spirits came back. So all those little things are little intangibles that you pick up along the way that kind of help us really develop the character. I think that person behind him.
Yeah, bonus question, also right over there.
Missed.
Yeah. No. Let's go right there. Right there. Okay. Right there.
I'm giving it to him.
Yeah.
Okay.
He can take it.
Oh, thanks, Mark, for making a very important movie. I really feel I'm a very important character in our history. So thank you for doing that, showing his character of who. Not just a character in a political field, but also just a character in general, day-to-day life. We should carry ourselves that way. My two questions. First question kind of touched upon it. How hard was it to get distribution for this movie? And then the second part, you talked about the difficulties on social media. I didn't really get to see a lot of ads for this. And was there pushback? And, so that's kind of a two-part question.
Yeah, well, the second question, that your case number one of what happened with Facebook in particular. So we have to push them for change. They need to treat everybody fairly across the board. And but to your first question, what was your first question, by the way?
Distribution.
Distribution, yeah. Once the movie is made, we had lots of folks that wanted to distribute the film, and so we could choose the best one. We went with a company called Showbiz Direct, which is a brand new company that some of the guys who used to work at Cinemark and used to work at Lionsgate were starting a new company. And we thought, boy, this would be exciting to be their first film. So we came out with, we had probably 12 offers, but we went with them. And then for all the DVD and digital, Lionsgate was our partner. And then for the rest of the world, Universal was our partner. So we had great partnerships with some of the biggest studios in Hollywood. And so don't believe everything you hear about
That's a very important point, right? It's not all doom and gloom. You were
Right.
able to connect and click with established players.
Yeah, in the case of Universal, we had a person in Universal who was really championing, really wanted the entire movie, but she was overruled by some of her bosses, so we went with a different company. But then later, when they saw that it was performing well, then they said, great, to her, you were right, let's get the rest of the world from them. And so that's how we went with Universal.
So after 19 years, after talking to dozens of people, what do you hope the audience comes away with, and what did you learn by making the film?
Yeah, I think the overall message, first of all, our director was Sean McNamara, who did a terrific job, but originally our director was going to be John Avildsen, who directed Rocky. I was thinking of the ads, from the director of Rocky comes Reagan. But John passed away at 81 years old. It was pretty suddenly of cancer. But John used to say to me, don't forget that Rocky was not about boxing. Boxing happened to be the guy's job. It's really about the man and all the obstacles he overcomes. And he said, in the same way, Reagan is not about politics per se. It's about the man, but his job happens to be in politics. So that always kind of guided us. But I think the message, the overall message of the film is that each of us has a destiny that we're supposed to do something. Maybe it's one thing, maybe it's a dozen things, but there's something that we were put on the planet to do. And in the case of Reagan, it took him about 69 years to figure out what that was, and he achieved it late. But that each of us has something, whatever it is. And there'll be obstacles in the path, but keep on the path and figure out what it is that you were put on the planet to do. And I think that's a message that we all can take home with us.
Making Reagan, a remarkable story, a great book, available everywhere. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Good luck.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you.